June 18, 1812. President James Madison signed a declaration that would forever change North America. The United States of America declared war on the mighty British Empire. But this wasn't a war about independence. That battle had been won 30 years earlier. This was a war of expansion, ambition, and miscalculation. This is the story of how America tried to conquer Canada. And nearly succeeded. To understand why America invaded Canada, we must understand the world of 1812. Europe was engulfed in the Napoleonic Wars. Britain and France were locked in a death struggle for continental supremacy. And caught in the middle was the young United States of America. Britain's Royal Navy was the most powerful maritime force in history. To maintain it, they needed sailors, lots of them. British naval officers began stopping American merchant ships on the high seas, forcibly removing sailors they claimed were British deserters. This practice, called impressment, enraged Americans. Between 1803 and 1812, the British impressed an estimated 10,000 American sailors into service, but there was another motivation, one that American politicians barely concealed. Canada. British-controlled. Canada stretched across the northern border, rich with resources and land. Many American war hawks, young, aggressive congressmen led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina believed Canada was ripe for the taking. Thomas Jefferson, the former president, confidently predicted that conquering Canada would be a mere matter of marching. How wrong he would be. In 1812, Canada, or British North America as it was officially known, was divided into two provinces, Lower Canada in the east, roughly modern-day Quebec, and Upper Canada in the west, roughly modern-day Ontario. The total population was about 500,000. Compared to America's 7.5 million, the British garrison in Canada numbered only about 5,000 regular troops, supplemented by local militia. Britain was focused on fighting Napoleon in Europe. Canada was a distant concern. On paper, an American invasion should have been a walkover. The American war plan was ambitious, a three-pronged invasion. The first prong would strike from Detroit across the Detroit River into Upper Canada. The second would cross the Niagara River between Lakes Ontario and Erie. The third would advance north from New York toward Montreal, the commercial heart of British North America. If successful, this coordinated attack would slice Canada into pieces, overwhelming the scattered British defenders. But coordination requires competent leadership, adequate supplies, and soldiers willing to fight. America was about to discover it, lacked all three. Let's meet the key players in this drama. On the American side, General William Hull, a 59-year-old Revolutionary War veteran who hadn't seen combat in 30 years. He would lead the invasion from Detroit. Hull was cautious, some said fearful. His officers would later call him a coward. For the Niagara front, the Americans had General Stephen Van Rensselaer, a New York politician with no military experience. He owed his command to politics, not competence. Against them stood one of the most remarkable military leaders in Canadian history, Major General Isaac Brock, at 43. Brock was energetic, bold, and beloved by his men. He understood that to save Canada, he couldn't wait for the Americans to strike. He had to attack first. And Brock had an ally, one who would prove decisive. Tecumseh, the great Shawnee war chief, had spent years trying to unite Native American tribes against American expansion. For Tecumseh, this war wasn't about defending British Canada. It was about saving indigenous lands from American settlers who pushed relentlessly westward. The alliance between Brock and Tecumseh would become legendary. On July 12, 1812, General William Hull led 2,500 American troops across the Detroit River into Canada. The invasion had begun. For the first few weeks, things went surprisingly well. Hull's army occupied the Canadian village of Sandwich, just across from Detroit. He issued a proclamation promising Canadians liberation from British tyranny. But Hull's nerve was already failing. Isaac Brock, nearly 300 miles away at York, modern-day Toronto, received news of the invasion. He immediately began moving west with whatever forces he could muster, about 300 British regulars and 400 Canadian militia. But Brock had a secret weapon, psychological warfare. On August 5th, Tecumseh's warriors ambushed an American supply convoy at Queenston. The Americans suffered casualties and retreated. When Hull learned that British allied Native American forces were active, his courage collapsed. He had heard terrifying stories of Native American warfare, stories of torture and scalping. The psychological pressure was too much. Brock arrived at Fort Malden, across from Detroit. On August 13th, he assessed the situation and made a daring decision, one that would become legendary. He would demand Hull's surrender. If Hull refused, Brock would attack. Even though he was outnumbered nearly 3-1, Brock sent Hull a message. The force at my disposal authorizes me to require of you the immediate surrender of Fort Detroit. It is far from my intention to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond control the moment the contest commences. It was a bluff. Brock suggested he had more men than he did, and he implied that once fighting started, he couldn't control Tecumseh's warriors from massacring the American garrison. Hull, already terrified, took the bait. On August 16, 1812, without firing a shot, General William Hull surrendered Detroit and his entire army, 2,500 men, to a force less than half its size. The first prong of America's invasion had not just failed, it had capitulated in humiliation. News of the surrender stunned the United States. How could a major American army surrender without fighting? Hull would later be court-martialed for cowardice and sentenced to death. Though President Madison commuted this sentence due to Hull's Revolutionary War service, for Brock and Tecumseh, it was a stunning victory. All of Michigan Territory was now in British hands. The alliance between the British general and the Shawnee chief had proven its power. The defeat at Detroit shocked America, but the war hawks demanded action. The second prong of the invasion would proceed, the attack across the Niagara River. On the night of October 12, 1812, General Stephen Van Rensselaer ordered his troops to cross the Niagara River from Lewiston, New York, to the Canadian village of Queenston. The objective: seize the heights above Queenston and establish a foothold in Canada. Around 3 a.m. on October 13th, the first wave of Americans, about 300 men, crossed the river under cover of darkness. They landed under the guns of a British battery positioned on the heights. The British opened fire. Chaos erupted. Captain John Wool, a young American officer, discovered something the British had missed: an unguarded fisherman's path leading up the cliff face. He led a group of Americans up this path, outflanking the British position. The Americans stormed the British battery and captured it. By dawn, they held the high ground. Isaac Brock was at Fort George, 7 miles away, when he heard the cannon fire. He immediately rode toward Queenston, gathering troops as he went. Brock arrived to find the Americans holding the heights. He knew that if they established themselves there, the entire British position on the Niagara frontier would collapse. Brock didn't hesitate. He led a charge up the hill to recapture the battery. But as he crested the rise, an American marksman shot him through the chest. Isaac Brock, the savior of Canada, fell dead at the age of 43. For a moment, it seemed the Americans had won. They held the heights, and the British commander was dead. The invasion appeared to be succeeding, but then the tide turned. British reinforcements arrived under General Roger Sheaffe, and from the woods emerged hundreds of Mohawk warriors led by John Norton, allied with the British. The Native American forces began firing on the Americans from the flanks. Meanwhile, on the American side of the river, something extraordinary was happening, or rather not happening. Thousands of New York militiamen refused to cross into Canada. They stood on the riverbank and watched as their comrades fought and died across the water. Why didn't they cross? The answer lay in a legal technicality. The militia's enlistment only required them to defend American territory, not invade foreign soil. They simply refused to obey orders to cross the border. General Van Rensselaer pleaded, cajoled, and threatened. The militiamen wouldn't budge. They watched as the British and Native American forces surrounded their trapped comrades on the heights. By afternoon, the Americans on the Canadian side were out of ammunition and surrounded. They tried to retreat, but British fire controlled the river crossing. At 3 p.m., the Americans surrendered. Nearly 1,000 American soldiers were captured, including 67 officers. The Battle of Queenston Heights was over. The Americans had lost again. And Isaac Brock, brave, bold Isaac Brock, was dead. He became a Canadian national hero, his legacy cemented by his death in defense of his adopted country. The third prong of the invasion, the advance on Montreal from New York, never really got started. General Henry Dearborn commanded this thrust, but his forces were poorly supplied and poorly trained. In November 1812, his army advanced a few miles into Lower Canada, skirmished with British forces, and then retreated back to New York. By the end of 1812, all three prongs of America's invasion of Canada had failed utterly. Not only had America failed to conquer Canada, it had lost Detroit. The mere matter of marching had become a national humiliation. But the war was far from over. In 1813, America would try again, this time with better preparation and more aggressive leadership. Key to controlling the Western theater was control of Lake Erie. Whoever controlled the lake controlled the supply lines and troop movements in the region. The Americans began building a fleet at Presque Isle, modern-day Erie, Pennsylvania, under the command of 27-year-old Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry, on September 10, 1813. Perry's 9 ships engaged 6 British warships commanded by Captain Robert Barclay in the Battle of Lake Erie. The fighting was brutal. Perry's flagship, the USS Lawrence, was shot to pieces, with 4/5 of his crew dead or wounded. Perry transferred his flag to another ship, the USS Niagara. Rowing through enemy fire in a small boat, from the Niagara, Perry rallied the American fleet and broke the British line. After 3 hours of fighting, the British surrendered. Perry sent his famous dispatch, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The victory on Lake Erie changed everything. British forces in the Detroit region could no longer be supplied. They were forced to retreat eastward into Upper Canada. General William Henry Harrison, who had replaced the disgraced Hull, pursued them with 3,500 men. Tecumseh's worst fears were being realized. The British were retreating, abandoning the Native American allies who had fought so bravely for them. British General Henry Proctor urged retreat. Tecumseh urged standing and fighting. Proctor prevailed on October 5, 1813. Near the Thames River in Upper Canada, Harrison's Americans caught up with the retreating British and Native American forces. The British regular troops broke almost immediately, fleeing the field. Tecumseh and his warriors fought on. In the chaos of battle, Tecumseh was shot and killed. His body was never positively identified. Some say his warriors carried it away to prevent desecration. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed to this day. Several American officers later claimed to have killed him, including Richard Mentor Johnson, who would later become vice president. Partly on the strength of that claim, Tecumseh's death was a catastrophe for Native American resistance. His grand vision of a unified Native American confederacy died with him. The tribes that had followed him scattered. Never again would Native Americans mount such an organized resistance to American westward expansion. For the British, it was also a blow. Tecumseh had been their most effective ally, charismatic, brilliant, and utterly committed. His loss was irreplaceable. In April 1813, the Americans achieved their most significant success in invading Canada. An American force of 2,700 men under General Henry Dearborn and Commodore Isaac Chauncey attacked York, the capital of Upper Canada, modern-day Toronto, on April 27th. American troops stormed ashore and assaulted Fort York. The British defenders, outnumbered more than 3-1, fought desperately. As the American advance became unstoppable, the British commander ordered the fort's gunpowder magazine destroyed to prevent its capture. The massive explosion killed over 200 American soldiers and wounded many more, including General Zebulon Pike, who died in the blast. Enraged by their losses, American troops went on a rampage through York. They looted homes, burned public buildings, and set fire to the Parliament buildings of Upper Canada. The burning of York would have consequences. When news reached Britain, there was outrage. British commanders swore revenge for the destruction of Canada's capital. That revenge would come in August 1814, when British troops marched into Washington, D.C. and burned the White House, the Capitol, and other government buildings in retaliation. But in the spring of 1813, the Americans had finally achieved a victory in Canada. York was occupied for several days before the Americans withdrew, taking with them everything of value they could carry. The Americans returned in July to burn what they had missed in April. For a moment, it seemed America might yet conquer Canada. Control of Lake Erie, the defeat of Tecumseh, the capture and burning of York, the momentum had shifted. But holding territory is harder than taking it. And the Americans were about to discover that fighting in Canada during winter was beyond their capacity. Through 1813 and into 1814, the war along the Canadian border settled into a brutal stalemate. The Americans won battles at Chippewa, at Fort Erie, but couldn't achieve a breakthrough. The British and Canadians won battles at Chrysler's Farm, at Chateauguay, but couldn't drive the Americans back permanently. The problem was fundamental. Neither side had the resources to conquer and hold large amounts of enemy territory. The Americans could mount raids and occupy towns temporarily, but they couldn't supply large armies in Canadian territory over winter. The British were fighting Napoleon in Europe and couldn't spare enough troops to invade and occupy American territory, and both sides were exhausted. The war was expensive and unpopular in many regions. In New England, there was even talk of secession over opposition to Mr. Madison's war. By 1814, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. Napoleon was defeated in Europe, freeing up thousands of British troops. Britain began sending reinforcements to North America, veteran soldiers who had fought against the French. The Americans, who had struggled to defeat the undermanned British forces in Canada, now faced a much more dangerous enemy. In August 1814, British troops landed in Maryland and marched on Washington, D.C. President Madison and the government fled. British forces burned the White House, the Capitol, and other public buildings in retaliation for the burning of York. It was America's greatest humiliation of the war, but the British couldn't capitalize on their success. An attack on Baltimore failed when Fort McHenry held out, an event immortalized in Francis Scott Key's poem, The Star-Spangled Banner. An invasion from Canada down to New York was turned back at the Battle of Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain. By late 1814, both sides were ready for peace. Negotiations had been ongoing in Ghent, Belgium. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. Its terms were simple: status quo ante bellum. Everything would return to how it was before the war. No territory changed hands. The border remained exactly where it had been. None of the issues that had caused the war, impressment, maritime rights, native lands, were even mentioned in the treaty. In a sense, everyone lost. America had failed to conquer Canada. Britain had failed to protect its Native American allies or to secure favorable territory. Native Americans lost everything: their land, their leaders, their hope of a homeland. But ask an American who won the War of 1812, and they'll tell you America did. We successfully defended against British invasion. We proved we could stand up to the world's greatest empire. The war produced national heroes Oliver Perry, Andrew Jackson, who won a stunning victory at New Orleans after the treaty was signed, but before news reached America. It gave us our national anthem. It sparked a surge of American nationalism and confidence. Ask a Canadian who won, and they'll tell you Canada did. The invasion was repulsed. British North America survived intact. The war forged a sense of Canadian identity separate from both Britain and the United States. Isaac Brock became a national martyr, a founding father. The war proved that Canada was not simply there for the taking. Ask a Native American who won, and the answer is clear: they lost. Tecumseh's Confederacy was destroyed. The British once. The invasion was repelled, abandoned their native allies. American westward expansion, briefly checked, resumed with even greater intensity after the war. The hopes and dreams of indigenous people for a homeland east of the Mississippi died at the Battle of the Thames. The American invasion of Canada is a forgotten chapter in American history, but a defining one in Canadian history. It's a reminder that not all invasions succeed, even when they seem inevitable. It's a reminder that geography, leadership, and alliances matter as much as numbers and resources. The Americans came to Canada confident of easy victory. They left bloodied, frustrated, and having learned a hard lesson. Conquest is never as easy as it looks on a map. The invasion failed. Canada survived. And North America would never be the same. This has been the time Americans invaded Canada and almost won.